Sometimes life strips away everything you thought you could count on, leaving you standing in the cold with nowhere left to turn. That's exactly where Josie Carver found herself, young, pregnant, and widowed, knocking at the gates of a remote ranch with winter closing in fast. "Can I work through winter?" she asked Thad Beaumont, the ranch owner who'd shut his heart off after losing his own family years before. He should have said no. He'd turned away others before. But something about her quiet strength reminded him of what he'd lost. So he gave her shelter, and slowly, as the snow deepened, two broken souls began to heal each other. When Josie's time came in the middle of a blizzard with no doctor for miles, would Thad's kindness be enough to save them both? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Hollow Pine Ranch stretched across 3,000 acres of Montana wilderness, where the Rocky Mountain foothills rolled into endless grassland, under a sky so vast it made a man feel both insignificant and eternal. October had painted the aspen groves in brilliant gold, but now those leaves lay scattered across the ground like abandoned dreams, and the bare branches reached toward grey clouds, heavy with the promise of snow. Thad Beaumont stood on his front porch at dawn, coffee steaming in his weathered hands, watching the mist rise from the valley below. At 62, he carried himself with the deliberate movements of a man who'd learned that rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes on a ranch could cost live human or animal. His face bore the deep lines of someone who'd spent decades squinting against wind and sun, but his blue eyes held a distance that spoke of losses deeper than any weather could carve. The ranch house behind him was solid timber and stone, built to withstand Montana winters that could kill the unprepared. Sarah had chosen every detail when they'd built it 30 years ago, the wide front porch where she'd planned to watch their children play, the large kitchen windows that would catch the morning light, the stone fireplace where the family would gather during the long winter evenings. Now dust motes danced in those carefully chosen sunbeams, and the silence echoed through rooms that had once rung with laughter. In the living room, pushed against the far wall and covered with a white sheet, sat the hand-carved rocking chair he'd made for Sarah when she was carrying Emma. He'd spent months on it, working by lamplight after his ranch duties were done, carving delicate flowers into the headrest and armrests. Roses, because Sarah loved roses and somehow managed to coax them to bloom even in this harsh climate. The chair had been her favorite spot for nursing Emma, for reading bedtime stories, for those quiet moments when she'd rock and hum and make their house feel like the center of the universe. Now it sat shrouded like a ghost, and Thad hadn't looked at it, really, looked at it in 7 years. His daily routine had become as predictable as the sunrise. Coffee at 5:30, checking the animals by 6, mending fence or fixing equipment until noon, a simple lunch eaten standing at the kitchen counter while reviewing the afternoon's work, more ranch duties until dark, a solitary dinner, and bed by 9. Weekends offered no variation. The routine was armor against memory, against the crushing weight of silence in a house built for voices he'd never hear again. The fever had taken them both within a week of each other. First Emma, just 5 years old, her small body burning despite every cool cloth and whispered prayer. Then Sarah, worn down from nursing their daughter and unable to fight off the infection that followed. In 10 days, Thad had gone from being a husband and father to being a man alone with 3,000 acres and no reason to work them beyond the simple fact that work was all he had left. He'd kept 2 part-time hand-sold Pete Garrison, who helped with the heavy lifting and knew when to work in comfortable silence, and young Miguel Santos, who came 3 days a week and understood that questions about the boss's personal life were unwelcome. They managed the cattle, maintained the buildings, and prepared for each season with the mechanical efficiency of men who understood that ranching was survival, not sentiment. The sound of wagon wheels on gravel interrupted his morning reflection. Through the mist, he could make out an unfamiliar figure approaching someone walking beside a horse-drawn cart, moving slowly as if every step required careful consideration. As the figure drew closer, Thad could see it was a young woman, maybe 25, with dark hair escaping from beneath a worn wool cap. Her coat was patched in several places and too thin for the weather, but she walked with her shoulders straight and her chin up. When she reached the gate, she stopped and looked up at him with steady brown eyes that held no pleading, only quiet determination. "Mr. Beaumont, I'm Josie Carver. I was hoping we might talk." He studied her for a long moment. She was clearly with child, though she tried to hide it beneath the loose coat. Her hands, gripping the gate, were work-roughened but gentle. There was something familiar about the way she stood, not broken by hardship, but shaped by it into something stronger. "Talk about what?" he asked, not moving from the porch. "Work," she said simply. "I'm good with animals and I'm not afraid of hard labor. I know it's late in the season, but I was wondering, can I work through winter?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Thad had turned away others over the years, drifters looking for easy shelter, men running from debts or law troubles, families hoping for charity they were too proud to ask for directly. The ranch was no place for charity cases, and winter on Hollow Pine was harsh enough to kill the unprepared. But something in Josie Carver's voice stopped his automatic refusal. Maybe it was the way she'd asked, not begging, not making excuses, just offering to work. Or maybe it was the way she stood waiting for his answer, ready to accept whatever he decided without argument or manipulation. "You have experience with cattle?" he asked. "I was raised on a ranch outside Billings," she replied. "My father ran a small operation, maybe 200 head. I can ride, rope, brand, and I know the signs of sickness in livestock. I can cook, mend, and I'm not afraid of getting my hands dirty." "And your husband, where's he?" A shadow crossed her face, but her voice remained steady. "Daniel passed from fever 3 weeks ago. The bank took the homestead. The town." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "The town wasn't inclined to help a pregnant widow with no family connections." Thad understood. Small communities could be cruel to outsiders, especially those who might become a burden. A pregnant woman alone was exactly the kind of responsibility that made town councils nervous and church committees whisper behind closed doors. "I have a bunkhouse that's not been used in years," he heard himself saying. "It's got a wood stove and a good roof, but it's basic, no fancy amenities." "I don't need fancy," Josie replied. "I need honest work and a safe place to have my baby." The word baby hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't been around a pregnant woman since Sarah, hadn't thought about birth and new life and all the hopes and fears that came with bringing a child into the world. For a moment, he almost changed his mind, almost told Josie Carver to try the next ranch over. But then he remembered Sarah's voice, the way she'd talked about helping others, about the responsibility that came with having more than you needed. "The bunkhouse needs cleaning," he said finally, "and the stove needs repair. If you're willing to put in the work to make it livable, we'll try it through winter. I can't pay much, but I'll provide meals and shelter." The relief that crossed Josie's face was quickly replaced by something else, gratitude, mixed with determination. "Thank you, Mr. Beaumont. You won't regret this." As she walked her horse and cart toward the old bunkhouse, Thad wondered if he was making a mistake. Winter on the ranch was hard enough without complications, and a pregnant woman alone was certainly a complication. But watching her examine the building with the practiced eye of someone who knew how to make the best of difficult circumstances, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: curiosity about another person's story. That evening, as he prepared his usual solitary dinner, he found himself cooking extra portions without thinking about it. When he realized what he'd done, he stood holding the serving spoon and staring at the pot of beef stew as if it had betrayed him. But the damage was done, and it seemed wasteful to throw the extra food away. He knocked on the bunkhouse door just as the sun was setting behind the mountains. Josie answered, her sleeves rolled up and cobwebs in her hair from cleaning. The interior behind her was transformed, swept clean, the windows scrubbed, and a small fire crackling in the repaired stove. "I made too much," he said awkwardly, holding out the pot. "Thought you might be hungry." "That's very kind," she replied, accepting the offering. "I was just thinking I should figure out cooking arrangements." They stood in the doorway for a moment, neither quite sure of the protocol. Finally, Thad cleared his throat. Kitchen window faces east. You'll see the light come on when I start coffee. You're welcome to join me for meals if you'd like. Makes more sense than cooking separately. I'd appreciate that, Josie said. And Mr. Beaumont, thank you again for taking a chance on me. Walking back to the main house, Thad tried to remember the last time he'd shared a meal with another person. Pete and Miguel always ate their lunches outside or in the barn, respecting his obvious preference for solitude. But tomorrow morning, someone would be sitting at his kitchen table, and for the first time in 7 years, he'd have to think about conversation with his coffee. That night, lying in the bed he'd shared with Sarah, he stared at the ceiling and wondered what he'd gotten himself into. Through the window, he could see the soft glow of lamplight from the bunkhouse where Josie Carver was settling into her new home. Tomorrow would bring the first of many changes he hadn't planned for, and changes, in Thad Beaumont's carefully ordered world, were things to be avoided at all costs. But it was too late now. The woman was here, winter was coming, and like it or not, his solitary existence was about to become something else entirely. The storm arrived 3 days earlier than the weather predictions suggested it would, rolling down from Canada like a grey wall of fury that turned the afternoon sky dark as twilight. Thad had been checking the fence line near the north pasture when he felt the temperature drop 20 degrees in 10 minutes and saw the cattle beginning to cluster together with the nervous energy that animals get when they sense danger. Approaching. He rode hard back to the ranch house, where Josie was hanging laundry on the line behind the kitchen. The wind had already begun whipping the sheets into wild dances, and she was fighting to gather them before they tore loose. "Storm's coming fast," he called out, dismounting quickly. "Big one. We need to get the cattle to shelter and secure everything that can blow away." Josie looked up at the darkening sky, her hand instinctively moving to her rounded belly. At 6 months along, her pregnancy was becoming more obvious despite her efforts to hide it beneath loose clothing. "What can I do to help?" "Get inside and stay warm," Thad replied automatically, then caught the flash of something disappointment, anger, in her eyes. In the 3 weeks since she'd arrived, Josie had proven herself capable of every task he'd given her, but he still found himself treating her like fragile goods when the real work needed doing. "Mr. Beaumont," she said firmly, "I told you I wasn't afraid of hard work. I meant it." Before he could argue, the first fat snowflakes began falling, and Pete Garrison came riding up from the south pasture with urgency written across his weathered face. "Boss, we got maybe an hour before this hits full force. The cattle in the lower meadow need moving, and that roof on the equipment shed is already starting to lift." Thad made a quick decision. "Pete, take the truck and secure the outbuildings. Josie, if you're determined to help, you can ride with me to move the cattle. But you stay back from the herd and follow my lead exactly." "I can handle myself around cattle," she replied, already moving toward the barn where her horse waited. What followed was an hour of controlled chaos. The cattle, sensing the approaching storm, were skittish and reluctant to move toward the sheltered valley, where they'd be protected from the worst of the wind. Josie rode position on the left flank of the herd, while Thad worked the right, and despite his initial concerns, she proved herself as capable as any cowhand he'd ever worked with. The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes that stuck to everything and began reducing visibility. When a young bull broke away from the herd and headed for the dangerous terrain near the canyon's edge, Josie reacted without hesitation, spurring her horse in pursuit and turning the animal back with the kind of rope work that spoke of years of experience. "Where'd you learn to ride like that?" Thad called out over the wind as they finally got the last of the cattle safely positioned. "My father," she replied, snowflakes catching in her dark hair. "He always said a rancher's daughter needed to be twice as good as anyone else if she wanted to be taken seriously." They made it back to the ranch buildings just as the storm hit with full fury. The wind howled like something alive and angry, driving the snow horizontally and making it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. Pete had secured the equipment and was already in the barn checking on the horses when they arrived. "Never seen one come on this fast," he shouted over the wind. "Weather service said maybe light snow tonight, building tomorrow. This is a full blizzard." As they worked together to ensure all the animals were safely sheltered, Thad found himself watching Josie with growing respect. She moved with confidence despite her condition, checking on each horse individually and making sure their water hadn't frozen. Her hands were gentle but sure as she examined a mare that seemed to be favoring one leg. "This one's got a stone bruise," she announced, running her hands down the horse's leg with practiced skill. "Not serious, but she should stay in tonight." It was nearly dark by the time they finished their work, and the three of them ran through the driving snow to the main house. In the warm kitchen, Pete helped himself to coffee while Josie shrugged out of her wet coat, revealing the medical journal she always carried, tucked inside her jacket. Thad noticed the book for the first time, leather-bound and worn smooth from handling. "Medical text?" he asked. Josie's hand went protectively to the volume. "It was Daniel's. He was studying to be a doctor before we married. This was his most treasured possession." Her voice softened. "He used to read passages to me, especially about childbirth and caring for mothers and babies. I guess I keep hoping some of his knowledge might have rubbed off on me." The admission hung in the warm air like a confession. Pete, sensing the weight of the moment, made his excuses about checking on his own cabin and headed back into the storm. Thad found himself alone with Josie for the first time since she'd arrived, and the silence stretched between them. "You're worried about having the baby out here," he said finally. It wasn't a question. "Dr. Matthews in town is getting on in years," Josie replied, settling into a chair at the kitchen table. "When I went to see him last week, he mentioned that his arthritis has been bothering him more this winter. Said he might not be able to make calls out to the ranches if we get snowed in bad." Thad felt a familiar chill that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Sarah had died from complications after Emma's birth, complications that might have been prevented if the doctor had been able to reach them sooner. The memory of holding his wife's hand while she grew weaker, of being helpless to save the woman he loved, was something he'd spent 7 years trying to forget. "When are you due?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "Late February, early March," Josie replied, "right in the heart of winter." Outside, the wind rattled the windows and drove snow against the glass like thrown sand. The storm was settling in for a long siege, and Thad realized with growing unease that this was just the beginning. Winter on Hollow Pine could last 6 months, with storms that isolated the ranch for weeks at a time. "That book of your husband's," he said carefully, "does it have information about delivering babies?" Josie nodded, her hand moving unconsciously to her belly. Daniel marked all the important passages. He was so excited about becoming a father, wanted to know everything about pregnancy and birth. "Sometimes I read those sections and pretend he's still teaching me." The pain in her voice was something Thad recognized intimately, the way grief could make the past feel more real than the present, the way memories could become a refuge from an uncertain future. But unlike his own retreat into solitude, Josie seemed to be using her loss as motivation to move forward. "My wife Sarah was a midwife before we married," he found himself saying. "Helped deliver dozens of babies in the area. She had her own collection of medical books and journals." "Had?" Josie asked gently. "They're still here somewhere, in boxes, I think." He paused, the words still difficult even after all these years. "After she died, I packed away most of her things, couldn't bear to look at them." The admission surprised him. He hadn't talked about Sarah's death with anyone, not even Pete, who'd been there through the worst of it. But something about Josie's quiet presence made the words come easier than they had in years. "Maybe," Josie said carefully, "maybe sometime you could show me where they are. Not for my sake, but for the babies. Knowledge like that shouldn't stay hidden away." Before Thad could respond, a tremendous gust of wind shook the entire house, and the lights flickered ominously. They both looked up at the ceiling, listening to the storm's fury, and Thad realized that this was a preview of what they'd face all winter: isolation, dependence on each other, and the constant awareness that when Josie's time came, they might be completely on their own. The thought terrified him more than any blizzard ever could. The blizzard lasted 3 days, burying the ranch under 4 feet of snow and leaving a crystalline silence in its wake. When the storm finally passed, the world outside looked transformed. Familiar landmarks, hidden under pristine drifts, fence posts marked only by their tips poking through the white expanse, and a sky so brilliantly blue it almost hurt to look at. Josie had spent the storm's duration reading Daniel's medical journal by the fire, while Thad worked on equipment maintenance in the basement workshop. They'd shared meals and brief conversations, but mostly they'd given each other space to process the reality of their situation. Now, as they dug out from the snow, a new rhythm began to establish itself. It started when Josie offered to take over the morning cooking duties. "I'm up early anyway," she said, standing in the kitchen doorway while Thad fumbled with the coffee pot. "Might as well make myself useful." "You don't need to," he began, but she was already moving past him to examine the contents of his pantry. "When's the last time you had a proper meal?" she asked, pulling out flour, eggs, and bacon. Something that didn't come out of a can or get heated up from yesterday's leftovers. Thad couldn't remember. Since Sarah's death, cooking had become purely functional fuel for his body, nothing more. But as Josie began preparing what smelled like genuine biscuits, he found himself lingering in the kitchen instead of heading straight out to the barn. "There's a recipe box somewhere," he said reluctantly. "Sarah's. She was particular about her cooking." Josie's hands stilled for a moment. "Would you mind if I looked for it? I'd like to learn how she made things." An hour later, Thad found himself in the dusty storage room off the kitchen, moving boxes and searching for something he'd hidden away years ago. When he finally located Sarah's recipe, boxer wooden container carved with roses that matched the rocking chair, his hands trembled slightly as he lifted the lid. Sarah's handwriting filled dozens of index cards, each recipe annotated with notes about family preferences and seasonal variations. Emma's favorite pancakes. Read one card. Add extra vanillish, says it tastes like happiness. Another noted, Thad likes his coffee cake with twice the cinnamon. "She knew what everyone loved," Josie said softly, reading over his shoulder. "That's a special gift." "She made this house feel like home," Thad replied, running his finger over Sarah's careful script. "I haven't tasted any of these dishes since." "Maybe it's time," Josie suggested gently. "Food is meant to be shared, to carry memories forward. She'd want these recipes to feed people again." That evening, Josie prepared Sarah's pot roast using the exact recipe, including the secret ingredient, a splash of coffee that Sarah had discovered by accident one busy Sunday. As the familiar aroma filled the kitchen, Thad felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the tight grip he'd kept on his grief. Over the following days, Josie transformed the sterile functionality of his meals into something that resembled family dinners again. She set the table with Sarah's good dishes, lit candles in the evening, and filled the silence with stories about her own childhood on her father's ranch. "Papa used to say that horses could sense your intentions before you even formed them in your mind," she told him one evening, describing her father's approach to training difficult animals. "He'd stand in the corral with a wild horse for hours, just breathing calmly and letting the animal get used to his presence." "Sounds like he understood them," Thad replied, watching her gentle hands as she folded napkins. There was something inherently graceful about Josie's movements, even as her pregnancy progressed and simple tasks became more challenging. "He understood that trust has to be earned," she said. "Animals know when you're trying to force something versus when you're inviting them to partnership." The observation felt pointed, though Thad couldn't tell if Josie intended it that way. Since her arrival, she'd never pushed him to talk more than he was comfortable with, never pried into his past, or demanded explanations for his solitary habits. Instead, she'd simply shown up each day, reliable and steady, letting him get used to her presence. It was during the second week after the storm that Josie's natural maternal instincts revealed themselves most clearly. Pete had found an injured barn cat, half frozen and with a badly wounded front paw, and brought it to the house more out of habit than hope. "Poor thing's probably done for," Pete said, holding the limp tabby in his work gloves, but seemed wrong to leave it out there. Josie immediately took charge, wrapping the cat in towels and examining its injuries with the same careful attention she'd shown the horses. "It's mostly exposure and exhaustion," she announced after a thorough inspection. "The paw is infected, but not beyond saving." She spent the next hour cleaning the wound, preparing a warm nest by the kitchen stove, and coaxing the semi-conscious animal to take small sips of warm milk mixed with honey. Her movements were confident and nurturing, the actions of someone who'd clearly done this kind of rescue work before. "You've got a gift with hurting things," Thad observed, watching her stroke the cat's matted fur. "Daniel used to say I had healing hands," Josie replied softly. "I think it's just that I know what it feels like to be scared and hurt and needing someone to care." The cat, whom Josie named Patches for his distinctive markings, recovered steadily under her care. Within a week, he was stalking mice in the barn and purring loudly whenever Josie appeared. But more significantly, Thad found himself looking forward to the evening reports on Patch's progress, enjoying Josie's delight in the animal's recovery. "He's putting on weight," she announced one evening, settling into what had become her regular chair at the kitchen table. "And his paw is healing beautifully. He'll be back to full hunting duties soon." "Sarah would have done the same thing," Thad said, the words emerging before he could stop them. "She couldn't bear to see anything suffer, if she could help it." Josie looked up from the cat food she was preparing. "Tell me about her. What kind of person was she?" For a moment, Thad considered deflecting the question, as he had countless times before. But something about the genuine interest in Josie's voice, combined with the warm domestic scene around them, made the words come easier. "She laughed at everything," he said finally. "Even when times were hard, even when the cattle prices dropped or the weather was against us, she'd find something to smile about. Said laughter was the only thing that made difficult days bearable." "Sounds like she was wise," Josie replied. "She was the strongest person I ever knew," Thad continued, surprised to find himself talking freely about memories he'd kept locked away. "But gentle with it, you know, never used her strength to hurt anyone, only to help." Outside, the wind was picking up again, promising another winter storm, but inside the kitchen felt warm and safe. Patches purred from his basket by the stove, the smell of Josie's dinner preparations filled the air, and for the first time in 7 years, Thad Beaumont felt something approaching contentment. It was a dangerous feeling, he knew. Contentment led to hope, and hope could be taken away as quickly as it was given. But as he watched Josie move around Sarah's kitchen with increasing familiarity, he couldn't quite bring himself to rebuild the walls he'd spent so many years constructing. It was while searching for extra blankets in the upstairs linen closet that Josie accidentally discovered Emma's room. She'd been looking for warmer bedding as December's grip tightened around the ranch, and when she opened what she thought was a storage closet, she found herself staring into a child's bedroom frozen in time. A small bed with a pink quilt sat against one wall, surrounded by toys that looked as if their owner had just stepped out to play in the yard. A wooden rocking horse stood in the corner, its painted mane still bright, while books were stacked neatly on shelves built at child height. But it was the wooden doll sitting propped against the pillows that caught Josie's attention, a beautifully carved figure with jointed limbs and a sweet painted face, clearly made with infinite love and attention to detail. She was still standing in the doorway, one hand unconsciously resting on her rounded belly, when Thad's voice came from behind her. "I should have warned you about that room." Josie turned to find him standing at the top of the stairs, his face carefully neutral, but his eyes holding a pain so deep it made her chest ache. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I was just looking for blankets, and I didn't realize." "Emma's room," he said simply, moving to stand beside her in the doorway. "She was 5 when the fever took her, haven't changed anything since." They stood together in the hallway, looking into the shrine to a little girl who would never grow up. Josie could see the love that had gone into every detail, the hand-painted flowers on the walls, the tiny chair beside the window, where a child could sit and watch for her father's return, the careful arrangement of toys that suggested bedtime stories and morning cuddles. "She was beautiful," Josie said, noticing the small framed photograph on the nightstand that showed a laughing child with Thad's blue eyes and her mother's gentle smile. "Smart as a whip, too," Thad replied, his voice rough with memory. "Always asking questions about everything. Why do cows eat grass? How do birds know which way to fly? Where do babies come from?" He paused, and Josie heard him swallow hard. Sarah used to say Emma was going to be a scientist or a teacher, someone who spent her life finding answers. "You made that doll for her," Josie observed, recognizing the same careful craftsmanship she'd seen in the furniture throughout the house. "For her 4th birthday. Took me 3 months of working evenings to get it right. She named her Rachel and took her everywhere." His voice dropped to almost a whisper. "It was the last gift I ever gave her." Josie felt tears prick her eyes, not just for the tragedy of lives cut short, but for the man standing beside her who had been carrying this grief alone for so many years. Her own loss felt fresh and raw, but she couldn't imagine the particular agony of losing a child. "Daniel and I talked about children," she said softly. "What we'd name them, how we'd raise them, what kind of parents we wanted to be. He had so many dreams about teaching our baby to ride, to read, to see the world with curious eyes." "The fever that took Emma and Sarah," Thad said after a long moment. "It started with chills and a slight cough. Nothing that seemed serious at first. By the time we realized how sick they were, the doctor couldn't get through because of a blizzard. I held them both as they died, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do to save them." The raw pain in his voice made Josie want to reach out and comfort him, but she sensed that touching him right now might shatter whatever control he was maintaining. Instead, she stayed still and let him talk. "That's why, when you ask about working through winter, I should have said no immediately. Winter on this ranch can be deadly, and he gestured toward her belly, "you're carrying precious cargo. If something happens, if there are complications, you're afraid history will repeat itself," Josie said, understanding flooding through her. "I can't watch someone else die because I couldn't protect them," Thad admitted. "I won't survive it again." Josie closed the door to Emma's room gently, then turned to face him fully. "I understand your fear, but I can't live my life or my baby's life as a prisoner to what might happen. Daniel died, yes, and it broke my heart. But shutting myself away from the world won't bring him back or guarantee that nothing bad will ever happen again." "You're braver than I am," Thad said. "I'm not brave," Josie replied. "I'm just tired of being afraid. This baby deserves a mother who believes in the possibility of joy, not one who spends every day waiting for disaster." That evening, as they sat together in the living room after dinner, the conversation that had been building for weeks finally came to the surface. Outside, snow was falling again, not the violent storm of weeks past, but the steady, determined accumulation that spoke of a long winter ahead. "When I was a girl," Josie said, looking up from the sock she was darning, "my mother used to tell me that grief was like a house with many rooms. She said you could choose to live in just one room, surrounded by your sadness, or you could slowly open doors and discover that the house had space for other things, too: hope, love, new memories." Thad looked up from the harness he was repairing. "Sounds like your mother was a wise woman." "She died when I was 16, Josie said matter-of-factly. "Cancer. For a while I thought I'd live in that one room forever. But Papa helped me understand that staying there wouldn't honor her memory, would waste the life she'd given me." "And your father? Is he still alive?" "He remarried 2 years after I wed Daniel. A good woman named Margaret who made him smile again. They moved to California to be near her children." Josie's needle moved steadily through the wool. "I could have gone with them, but Daniel's grave is here in Montana, and I wasn't ready to leave him behind." "But you left when you came here," Thad observed. "I brought him with me," Josie replied, touching the worn medical journal that lay on the table beside her. "His dreams for our child, his hopes for the future, his belief that love was stronger than fear. Those things don't require a specific place to exist." The fire crackled in the grate, and outside the wind played a lonely song through the pine trees. Thad found himself studying Josie's profile as she worked, noting the determined set of her jaw and the gentle curve of her hands, protecting the life growing within her. "You make it sound simple," he said finally. "Not simple," Josie corrected. "Just possible. There's a difference." As they prepared for bed that night, Thad paused outside Emma's door for the first time in years, his hand resting on the doorknob. Inside, he knew, the wooden doll still waited on the bed, and the rocking horse still stood ready for a rider who would never come. But for the first time since he'd closed that door 7 years ago, the thought of opening it again didn't feel impossible. December brought the kind of cold that made the air itself seem brittle, and with it came the realization that Christmas was approaching, whether they acknowledged it or not. Josie had mentioned the date only once, in passing, when she noted that her baby would likely be born sometime after the new year. But Thad could see her touching the thin gold chain around her neck more frequently, the one that held Daniel's wedding ring close to her heart. He'd been avoiding any thoughts of the holiday season for 7 years, treating December 25th as just another day to feed the cattle and repair equipment. Sarah and Emma had loved Christmas with the kind of wholehearted joy that made the entire month sparkle, and after their deaths, the season had become a minefield of painful memories. But now, watching Josie move carefully around the kitchen as her pregnancy progressed, he found himself remembering not just the grief, but the warmth that Christmas had once brought to this house. Sarah humming carols while she baked, Emma's wide-eyed wonder at the presents under the tree, the way the living room had glowed with candlelight and laughter. "My father used to cut a tree from our back 40 every year," Josie mentioned one evening as they sat by the fire. "Nothing fancy, but Mama would string popcorn and cranberries, and we'd make paper angels to hang on the branches. Even during the lean years, we always had a tree." Thad looked up from the ledger he was updating. "You miss the traditions." "I miss the feeling," Josie corrected gently. "The sense that even in the darkest time of year, there was light and hope and reason to celebrate." "Daniel and I were planning to start our own traditions this year, our first Christmas as a married couple, and probably our last before the baby came." The wistfulness in her voice stirred something in Thad that he'd thought was buried beyond resurrection. "There are trees on the north slope," he heard himself saying, "pines that would work if you wanted to cut one." Josie's face brightened with surprise, and something deeper gratitude that he would offer to participate in creating light during the season of darkness. "Would you help me choose one? I'm not sure I trust my balance on uneven ground these days." 2 days later, they rode out together through snow that crunched under the horses' hooves like broken glass. Josie sat carefully in her saddle, moving with the deliberate caution of someone carrying precious cargo, while Thad led them toward the grove where straight, well-shaped pines grew in abundance. "That one," Josie said, pointing to a 6-foot tree with perfectly balanced branches. "It's beautiful." As Thad cut the tree, he found himself remembering the last time he'd done this task. Emma riding on his shoulders, Sarah directing the operation with laughing authority, all of them singing off-key versions of Christmas carols. The memory should have hurt, but somehow, with Josie's quiet presence beside him, it felt more like a gift than a wound. Back at the house, they set up the tree in the corner of the living room, where Sarah had always preferred it near the window, so its lights could be seen from outside. Josie produced a small box of ornaments from her belongings, simple handmade decorations that she and Daniel had collected during their brief marriage. "These aren't much," she said apologetically, holding up a felt star stitched with careful precision. "They're perfect," Thad replied, and meant it. As they decorated the tree together, he told her stories about past Christmases. Emma's excitement on Christmas morning, Sarah's famous sugar cookies that the entire county looked forward to, the way this room had once rung with voices and laughter. "They sound like wonderful people," Josie said, hanging Daniel's last gift to her, a delicate glass ornament shaped like a doveian, a prominent branch. "They were," Thad agreed. "Sarah always said Christmas wasn't about the presents or the fancy food. It was about acknowledging that light exists even in the darkness, that love continues even when everything else seems uncertain." That evening, as they sat before the glowing tree, Josie asked the question that had been building between them for weeks. "Will you tell me how you met Sarah?" Thad was quiet for so long that Josie thought he wouldn't answer, but finally he began to speak, his voice soft with memory. "I was 25, struggling to keep this ranch going after my father died. Sarah was the school teacher in town, and she came out here because one of the children in her class, Jimmy Morrison from the next ranch, had been missing school. She was convinced something was wrong. Was it? Jimmy's mother had been sick, and the family was too proud to ask for help. Sarah took one look at the situation and organized half the county to bring food, medicine, and assistance. She had this way of making charity feel like neighborhood friendship." Josie smiled, recognizing the description of someone who understood how to help others maintain their dignity. "How did you convince her to marry you?" "I didn't convince her of anything," Thad replied, with the first real smile Josie had seen from him. "She convinced me. I was so focused on the ranch, on proving I could handle everything alone, that I barely noticed her at first. But she kept showing upbringing books for me to read, helping with sick animals, gradually becoming part of the fabric of this place. One day I realized I couldn't imagine the ranch without her. And Emma came along 3 years later. Sarah had 2 miscarriages before Emma, and we'd almost given up hope of having children. When Emma was born healthy and strong, Sarah said it was proof that miracles still happened for ordinary people." Josie's hand moved instinctively to her own belly, where her baby was moving with increasing strength and frequency. "Do you think they would have liked me, Sarah and Emma?" The question surprised Thad with its vulnerability. "Sarah would have loved you," he said without hesitation. "She had a gift for seeing the best in people, and she would have recognized your strength immediately. Emma would have followed you around like a puppy, asking a million questions about the baby and trying to help with everything." "I wish I could have known them," Josie said softly. "You do know them," Thad replied, looking around the room where Sarah's recipes had created familiar smells, where Emma's memory lived in the stories he was finally able to tell. "They're here in this house, in the life we're building. Sarah always believed that love didn't end with death, it just changed form." Outside, the wind was picking up again, promising another storm, but inside the house felt warm and safe and full of possibilities. As Josie prepared for bed that night, she paused at the base of the stairs and looked back at Thad, who was banking the fire for the night. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" "For letting Christmas happen again, for sharing your memories, for making me feel like I belong here." After she'd gone upstairs, Thad sat in the darkened living room, watching the colored lights reflect off the window glass and feeling something shift inside his chest. For 7 years, he'd believed that love was a finite resource, that he'd used up his capacity for caring when Sarah and Emma died. But watching Josie bloom in his house like a flower finding sunlight, seeing her gentle hands bring healing to hurt creatures and warmth to cold rooms, he was beginning to understand what Sarah had meant about love changing form rather than ending. The ring around Josie's neck caught the tree lights as she moved, and Thad found himself wondering what it would feel like to see her wear a different ring on that meant she'd chosen to stay, not out of necessity, but out of something deeper and more lasting. The false labor pains struck Josie on New Year's Eve, during the worst blizzard of the winter so far. She'd been helping Thad prepare extra feed for the animals when the first contraction hit, doubling her over with its intensity and sending a bolt of pure terror through both of them. "It's too early," she gasped, one hand gripping the barn wall for support, while the other pressed against her belly. "The baby's not due for another 2 months. Thad's face went white as he caught her arm, steadying her. "Are you sure it's labor? Could it be something else?" Another wave of pain crossed Josie's features, and she breathed carefully through it, the way Daniel's medical book had instructed. "I don't know. The pain feels real, but the timing." She looked up at him with eyes bright with fear. "Thad, if this baby comes now, it won't survive. Premature births require medical equipment we don't have." Outside, the wind howled with a fury that made their previous storms seem gentle by comparison. Snow was falling so thickly that the barn door, only 20 feet away, was barely visible. The phone lines had been down for 3 days, and the road to town was impassable even with the truck chains. "Let's get you back to the house," Thad said, his voice steadier than he felt. "We'll figure this out step by step." The journey from barn to house, normally a simple walk, became an epic struggle against wind and driving snow. Thad wrapped his coat around Josie and guided her carefully across the treacherous ground, both of them fighting for breath in the Arctic air. By the time they reached the kitchen, Josie was shaking from cold and exhaustion, and another contraction was building. "Upstairs," Thad said, helping her toward the stairs. "You need to lie down and rest. Sometimes false labor stops if you change positions." In the guest room where Josie had been sleeping since the bunkhouse became too cold for comfort, Thad helped her settle into bed, while his mind raced through everything he could remember about Sarah's pregnancies. With Emma, there had been several episodes of false labor that had sent them rushing to town unnecessarily. The doctor had explained that practice contractions were normal, especially in first pregnancies. But this felt different. The intensity of Josie's pain, the way she curled in on herself with each wave, the growing frequency of the contractions, it all seemed too real to be practice. "Daniel's book," Josie whispered between pains. "There's a section about premature labor. Maybe it explains what to do." Thad found the worn medical journal and flipped through pages marked with Daniel's careful notes until he located the relevant chapter. As he read aloud about the signs and treatments for early labor, both of them searched for reassurance that this crisis might pass. "It says bed rest and hydration can sometimes stop false labor," Thad reported, "and that stress or physical exertion can trigger contractions that aren't actually productive." "I was lifting heavy feed buckets," Josie admitted. "Maybe I overdid it." For the next hour, they followed the book's recommendations, Josie resting on her left side, sipping water regularly, trying to relax, despite the storm raging outside and the fear consuming them both. Gradually, mercifully, the contractions began to space out and weaken. "I think it's stopping," Josie said finally, her voice weak with relief. "The pain is fading." Thad sat in the chair beside her bed, his own hands shaking now that the immediate crisis seemed to be passing. "You scared 10 years off my life," he admitted. "I scared myself," Josie replied. For a moment there, I thought. She couldn't finish the sentence, but Thad understood. They'd both been imagining the nightmare scenario of a premature birth in a blizzard, with no medical help and no way to save a baby too small to survive. "We need to be more careful," Thad said. "No more heavy lifting, no more working in dangerous conditions. I can't lose." He stopped himself before completing the thought, but the words hung in the air between them. "You can't lose what?" Josie asked softly. Thad looked at her lying there, her dark hair spread across the pillow, her hands protectively covering the life growing within her, and felt something break open in his chest that he'd kept locked away for 7 years. "I can't lose you," he said simply. "Either of you. I know that's not fair to say, and I know it complicates everything, but sitting here watching you in pain, thinking I might have to watch you die the way I watched Sarah die, I realized that somewhere along the way, you've become more than just someone I'm helping through the winter." Josie's eyes filled with tears, and her hand went instinctively to the chain around her neck, where Daniel's ring rested. "Thad, I'm not asking you to choose," he said quickly. "I'm not asking you to stop loving Daniel or to make any decisions about the future. I'm just telling you that you matter to me now. You and this baby matter to me in a way I didn't think was possible anymore." "You matter to me too," Josie whispered. "More than I should probably admit. When I first came here, I thought I was just looking for shelter and work, but you've given me something I didn't even know I needed." "What's that?" "A reason to believe in tomorrow again. Daniel's death left me feeling like my future had died with him. But being here, seeing how you've survived your own losses and still found ways to be kind, to care for things, it's shown me that hearts can heal without forgetting." They sat in the quiet room while the storm raged outside, both of them processing the admission that their arrangement had become something deeper and more complicated than either had planned. The practical reality remained unchanged. Josie was widowed and pregnant with another man's child. Thad was a grieving widower who'd sworn never to risk his heart again, but the emotional landscape had shifted permanently. "The quilt," Josie said suddenly, looking toward the corner where Sarah's unfinished needlework sat in a basket. "You said Sarah was making it for Emma before she died." "She never got to finish it," Thad confirmed. "I found it after the funeral, still on her sewing table with the needle and thread exactly where she'd left them." "Would you mind if I completed it? For my baby?" Josie asked. "It seems like it should be used for its intended purpose, even if not in the way Sarah originally planned." The request should have felt like a violation, a painful reminder of all he'd lost. Instead, Thad found himself imagining Sarah's pleasure at knowing her work would finally wrap around a child who needed it. "She'd like that," he said. "Sarah always believed that love should be practical, that it should warm people and comfort them and make their lives better. A quilt sitting unfinished in a basket doesn't help anyone." As the storm gradually exhausted itself and moved on toward the eastern mountains, Thad and Josie sat together working on the quilt sheet, stitching the remaining squares while he held the fabric steady and told her about Sarah's careful planning for each pattern and color. "She wanted it to tell a story," he explained, pointing to the progression of seasons represented in the fabric choices. Winter to spring to summer to autumn, then back to winter again. The cycle of life continuing no matter what changes come. "It's beautiful," Josie said, running her fingers over Sarah's tiny, precise stitches. "And it feels right, somehow, to be completing it during a storm. Like we're keeping the darkness at bay with needle and thread." When they finally finished near dawn, the quilt spread across Josie's bed like a blessing. They both understood that something fundamental had changed between them. The crisis had forced them to acknowledge feelings they'd been carefully avoiding, and there was no going back to the careful distance they'd maintained before. Outside, the sun was rising over a world transformed by snow, and inside, two people who'd thought they were done with love were discovering that the heart has room for more than one chapter. It was while organizing Sarah's sewing supplies that Josie discovered the letters. She'd been looking for more thread to finish the quilt's binding when she found them tucked beneath the lining of Sarah's sewing basket, 3 envelopes, addressed to Thad, in handwriting that grew progressively weaker with each one. The first envelope was marked, "To be opened after I'm gone." The second, "When you're ready to remember us with joy." And the third, in barely legible script, "When you find love again." All 3 bore the unmistakable signs of being written by someone who knew death was approaching, careful words, chosen with the precision of someone making final arrangements. Josie's hands trembled as she held the letters, understanding immediately what they represented and what their discovery meant. Thad had never mentioned finding any final messages from Sarah, which suggested he'd either never looked for them or had been unable to face reading them. Either way, these words from his beloved wife had been waiting 7 years to be heard. She found Thad in the barn, mucking out stalls with the methodical intensity he applied to any task that allowed him to avoid thinking about complicated emotions. The morning light streaming through the high windows caught the silver threading through his dark hair, and Josie felt her heart clench with the realization that she was about to either heal an old wound or tear it open wider. "Thad," she said softly, not wanting to startle him, "I found something while I was organizing Sarah's sewing things. I think you need to see this." He looked up from his work, and when he saw the letters in her hands, the color drained from his face. "Where did you find those?" "Hidden in her sewing basket, under the lining." "I don't think she wanted them to be discovered accidentally. She wanted them to be found when someone was really looking through her things." Josie held out the envelopes with careful reverence. "Have you ever seen them before?" Thad set down the pitchfork and took the letters with hands that shook slightly. After the funeral, I couldn't bear to go through her personal belongings. I packed everything away as quickly as possible and never looked back. I thought if there had been anything important, she would have told me before she died." Maybe these were too important to say out loud, Josie suggested gently. Maybe she needed to write them when she had time to choose exactly the right words. For a long moment, Thad just stared at the envelopes, as if trying to decide whether opening them would bring comfort or unbearable pain. Finally, he broke the seal on the first letter with the careful precision of someone handling something sacred. Sarah's handwriting filled 2 pages, and as Thad read silently, Josie watched emotions play across his face: surprise, sorrow, and something that might have been relief. She knew she was dying, he said finally, his voice rough. She'd known for weeks before the fever got bad. She was trying to prepare me for after. What does she say? Thad's throat worked as he swallowed hard. She talks about the life we built together, about how proud she was of the man I'd become, about how she wasn't afraid to die because she knew she'd been truly loved. And his voice broke slightly, she says she's sorry that loving her will cause me pain, but that she hopes someday I'll remember that the pain is proof of how beautiful what we had was. Josie felt tears prick her eyes at the generosity of a dying woman who spent her final strength trying to comfort the husband she was leaving behind. She sounds like she was an extraordinary person. She was, Thad agreed, carefully folding the first letter and reaching for the second. This one's different. She talks about specific memories, things she wants me to remember about our time together and about Emma. Listen to this. Remember how Emma used to sneak down on Christmas morning and rearrange all the presents because she thought she was helping Santa organize better? Remember how she insisted that horses could understand English if you spoke slowly enough? Remember how she hugged every animal on the ranch because she said they needed to know they were loved? The letter continued with page after page of precious moments that Sarah had wanted to preserve just for Thad's memory, but as a legacy of the joy their small family had shared. Reading her words, Josie could picture the warmth and laughter that had once filled this house, and she understood why Thad had been so afraid to risk loving again. "And the third letter?" Josie asked, though something in Thad's expression suggested it contained the most difficult words of all. With hands that shook visibly now, Thad opened the final envelope. This letter was shorter, written in the painfully weak script of someone fighting exhaustion and medication, but its message was crystal clear. "My dearest Thad," he read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper, "if you're reading this, it means you found room in your heart for someone new. I hope so. I've been praying for it since the day I realized I wouldn't get well. You were meant to love and be loved, to share your strength and gentleness with someone who needs them. Don't let guilt over loving me prevent you from loving again. The heart doesn't have a limited supply, it grows larger with each person it holds." Thad stopped reading, overcome, but Josie could see there was more. "Please," she said softly, "finish it. I've been watching you with our daughter, seeing how naturally tenderness comes to you, and I know you'll be a wonderful father to other children if you allow yourself that gift. Don't let our deaths convince you that love ends in loss. Let them remind you that love is so powerful it echoes through time. Be happy, my darling. Choose joy. Choose life. Choose love when it finds you again, because I promise you, it will find you again. All my love, Sarah." The barn fell silent, except for the soft sounds of horses moving in their stalls and the distant whistle of wind through the eaves. Thad held the letters as if they were made of something more precious than paper, and Josie saw 7 years of guilt and self-imposed isolation cracking open like ice in spring. "She gave you permission," Josie said finally. "She wanted you to love again." "She was dying," Thad replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "She might have said anything to try to make me feel better." "Do you really believe that? Do you think Sarah would have used her last strength to write something she didn't mean with every fiber of her being?" Thad looked down at the letters again, then up at Josie, and she saw the exact moment when he stopped fighting the truth he'd been avoiding. She always did know me better than I knew myself. Even at the end, she was trying to take care of me. "What does this change?" Josie asked, though her heart was hammering so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Everything," Thad said simply. "I've been carrying around this idea that loving you would be a betrayal of Sarah's memory, that I only had room in my heart for one great love. But she's telling me that's not how love works, that it multiplies rather than divides. He stepped closer to Josie, close enough that she could see the tears in his eyes and the way his hands trembled as he reached up to touch her face. "I love you," he said, the words carrying 7 years of suppressed emotion. "I love your strength and your gentleness and the way you've brought this house back to life. I love that you're carrying a child who'll grow up knowing what it means to be wanted and cherished. And I love that you helped me find these letters, even knowing they might change everything between us." "They have changed everything," Josie whispered, her own tears flowing freely now. "But maybe that's what needed to happen. Maybe we both needed permission to stop living in the past and start building something new." Outside, a late winter storm was gathering strength, but inside the barn, 2 people who'd thought their capacity for love had died with their losses were discovering that the heart's ability to heal and hope and love again was far greater than either had dared to imagine. The Weather Service had been issuing warnings for 3 days about the massive storm system moving down from Canada, but even the most dire predictions couldn't capture the true scope of what was heading toward Hollow Pine Ranch. This wasn't just another winter blizzard, it was what old-timers called a 100-year storm, the kind that rewrote the landscape and lived on in local legend for generations. Thad stood at the kitchen window, watching the barometric pressure drop so rapidly he could feel it in his bones. The horses were restless, pacing in their stalls with the nervous energy that animals display before natural disasters. Even Patches, normally unflappable, had been hiding under the furniture for 2 days. "How bad is it going to be?" Josie asked, joining him at the window. At 8 months pregnant now, she moved with the careful grace of someone carrying precious cargo, one hand always resting protectively on her rounded belly. "Bad enough that we could be cut off from the outside world for weeks," Thad replied honestly. "The storm's supposed to bring wind gusts over 70 miles per hour and snow accumulation that could reach 6 feet in the drifts. If it hits as hard as they're predicting, we won't see a plow until sometime in March." The implications hung unspoken between them. Josie's due date was still 3 weeks away, but babies had their own schedules, and if this storm trapped them at the ranch with no way to reach medical help, they would be completely on their own for the birth. "Are you scared?" Josie asked, though her steady voice suggested she was asking more about his emotional state than her own fears. "Terrified," Thad admitted, turning from the window to look at her. "Not of the storm itself, but of history repeating itself, of losing you the way I lost Sarah." It had been 2 weeks since they'd found Sarah's letters. 2 weeks since they'd finally acknowledged the love that had been growing between them throughout the winter. The emotional transformation had been swift and profound, as if admitting their feelings had unlocked something that had been waiting to bloom. But with love had come renewed vulnerability, and Thad found himself haunted by visions of complications he couldn't handle, of watching Josie suffer while he stood helpless. "That's not going to happen," Josie said firmly, taking his hands in hers. "We're prepared. We have Daniel's medical journal, we have the supplies we've been gathering, and we have each other. That's more than many women have had throughout history." Over the past month, they'd been methodically preparing for the possibility of an isolated birth. Thad had ordered medical supplies through the feed store, sterile instruments, medications, anything that might be needed in an emergency. Josie had studied every page of Daniel's journal until she could recite the procedures from memory. They'd even practiced the basic steps, using one of the barn cats as a cooperative patient while they rehearsed positioning and timing. But all the preparation in the world couldn't eliminate the fundamental reality that childbirth was dangerous, especially without professional medical support. The statistics in Daniel's journal were sobering. Given under ideal conditions, complications could arise that required surgical intervention or medications they simply didn't have. "There's something I need to show you," Thad said, making a decision he'd been avoiding for weeks. "Something I've been working on." He led Josie to the workshop in the basement, where he'd been spending his evenings for the past month. In the corner, covered with a sheet, sat a project that represented both his hopes and his fears for the future. When he pulled away the covering, Josie gasped. Before them stood the most beautiful cradle she'd ever seen, hand-carved from rich walnut wood, with delicate scrollwork along the sides, and a gentle rocking motion that would soothe the most restless baby. Every surface was polished to a warm glow, and the craftsmanship was so exquisite it belonged in a museum. "Thad," she whispered, running her fingers along the smooth wood. "When did you make this?" "I've been working on it since Christmas," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "At first, I told myself it was just something to keep my hands busy during the long evenings. But the truth is, I wanted your baby to have something beautiful to sleep in, something made with love." The word "our" hung in the air between them, carrying weight that went far beyond simple possession. In calling Josie's child "our baby," Thad was declaring his intention to be not just a guardian or protector, but a father in every sense that mattered. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," Josie said, tears streaming down her face. "But Thad, you don't have to. I mean, just because we care about each other doesn't mean you're obligated to." "Stop," Thad interrupted gently, placing his hands on her shoulders. "I'm not doing this out of obligation. I'm doing it because somewhere along the way, this stopped being about helping you through a difficult time and became about building a family. The three of us, you, me, and this baby, we're already a family in every way that matters." Josie leaned into his embrace, feeling the solid warmth of his chest against her cheek and the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "I love you," she whispered, "not because you saved me, not because I need someone to take care of me, but because you're the kind of man who carves cradles in secret and reads bedtime stories to barn cats and makes me believe that happy endings are possible." "I love you too," Thad replied, his arms tightening around her, "and I'm going to make you a promise right now. No matter what this storm brings, no matter what complications might arise, I will not lose you. I will not lose this baby. I'll fight for both of you with everything I have." The next 24 hours passed in a blur of final preparations. They moved all the birthing supplies to the main house, stocked the pantry with enough food to last weeks, and filled every available container with water in case the pipes froze. Pete came by to help secure the outbuildings and move the most vulnerable animals to the reinforced barn, his weathered face grim with concern. 40 years I've been working ranches in Montana," Pete told Thad as they reinforced the chicken coop. "This feels different, bigger, like nature's getting ready to remind us who's really in charge." By evening, the wind was already picking up, sending loose snow swirling across the yard in ghostly spirals. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees since morning, and the western sky was an ominous wall of dark clouds that seemed to swallow the horizon. Thad and Josie spent their last quiet evening together, sitting by the fire, not talking much, but taking comfort in each other's presence. Josie worked on the final touches of the baby's quilt, while Thad read from one of Sarah's favorite books, a collection of poems about hope and endurance that seemed appropriate for the night before a battle. "Do you think we're ready?" Josie asked as they prepared for bed. "As ready as we can be," Thad replied. "We have supplies, we have knowledge, and we have love. Sometimes that has to be enough." But as they settled into their respective rooms, they'd agreed to wait until after the baby was born before sharing a bed. Out of respect for the complexity of their situation, both of them lay awake, listening to the wind grow stronger and feeling the atmospheric pressure drop like a stone. At 3 in the morning, the first serious contractions began. Josie woke to a pain that wrapped around her entire midsection like a giant fist squeezing with deliberate pressure. She lay still for a moment, timing the sensation and hoping it might be another false alarm. But the intensity and regularity told her this was different. Outside, the storm had arrived with the fury of something alive and angry. Wind howled around the house with a sound like nothing she'd ever heard, and snow pelted the windows with the force of thrown gravel. The lights flickered ominously, reminding them both how quickly they could lose their connection to the modern world. "Thad," she called softly, not wanting to panic, but needing him to know that their worst fears and greatest hopes were about to collide in the perfect storm of nature's making. When he appeared in her doorway, still half asleep but instantly alert, she saw her own mixture of terror and determination reflected in his eyes. "It's time," she said simply. And outside, as if in response to her words, the storm unleashed its full fury on the small ranch where two people who'd thought they were done with miracles were about to discover that love and hope and new life could triumph even in the darkest hour. The storm reached its peak fury just as Josie's labor intensified, as if nature itself was determined to test every ounce of courage and determination they possessed. Wind screamed around the house with a voice like a living thing in agony, driving snow against the windows so hard that the glass shook in its frames. The power flickered twice before finally surrendering, plunging them into a world lit only by kerosene lamps and the glow from the fireplace. Thad moved through the house with methodical precision, lighting every available lamp and stoking the fires in both the main room and the bedroom where Josie labored. His hands were steady as he performed these familiar tasks, but inside, his heart hammered against his ribs with the rhythm of pure terror. "How far apart are the contractions now?" he asked, settling into the chair beside Josie's bed, with Daniel's medical journal open on his lap, and Sarah's old midwifery textbook recovered from the storage room that morning within easy reach. "About 6 minutes," Josie replied, breathing carefully through another wave of pain. "And they're getting stronger, much stronger than the false labor we had before." Thad consulted the books, cross-referencing symptoms and timing against the careful notes both Daniel and Sarah had made in their margins. Everything suggested they were still in early labor, with hours yet to go before the baby would actually arrive. But the intensity of Josie's discomfort was progressing faster than the textbooks suggested it should. "The books say first babies usually take 12 to 20 hours, he told her, trying to keep his voice calm and reassuring. "We have time to work through this step by step." But even as he spoke, another contraction gripped Josie, this one strong enough to make her cry out involuntarily. Thad watched her face transform with pain, and for a terrifying moment, he was transported back 7 years to another stormy night, when he'd sat helplessly beside Sarah's bed while she fought a battle he couldn't help her win. "Don't," Josie said sharply, as if reading his thoughts. "Don't go back there. I'm not Sarah. This isn't the same situation, and you're not helpless. You know things now that you didn't know then." She was right, and Thad forced himself to focus on the present moment. He did know things now. He'd spent weeks studying every relevant passage in both medical books, had practiced procedures until his hands could perform them automatically, had gathered supplies and prepared contingencies for various complications. "You're right," he said, reaching for her hand. "We're going to get through this together. Just keep breathing the way the book describes, and let me know if anything feels different or wrong." The next few hours passed in a strange rhythm of intensity and calm. Between contractions, they talked quietly about practical matter show to position the baby after birth, when to cut the umbilical cord, what signs to watch for that might indicate problems. During contractions, Josie gripped Thad's hand with surprising strength while he coached her through the breathing techniques Daniel had marked as most effective. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the ranch with unrelenting fury. Trees that had stood for decades bent nearly horizontal under the wind's force, and snow drifted against the house until the first-floor windows were completely obscured. The isolation was complete now. Even if they'd had access to a phone, no vehicle could move through the white chaos beyond their walls. "Thad," Josie said during a brief respite between contractions, "if something goes wrong—" "Nothing's going to go wrong," he interrupted firmly. "But if it does," she continued, "I need you to promise me something. Save the baby. Whatever choice you have to make, choose the baby." The request hit Thad like a physical blow. "Don't ask me to make that kind of decision. Don't even think about it." "I'm thinking about it because I have to," Josie replied, her voice steady despite the pain. "This baby is innocent, and it deserves every chance at life. Promise me." Thad looked into her determined brown eyes and saw the same fierce maternal protectiveness that had driven Sarah to fight for Emma even when her own strength was failing. The parallel should have terrified him, but instead it reminded him of why he'd fallen in love with Josie in the first place: her courage, her selflessness, her absolute commitment to protecting the life she carried. "I promise to save you both," he said finally. "That's the only promise I'm making." Around midnight, everything changed. Josie's contractions suddenly intensified, coming closer together and lasting longer than anything the books had prepared them for. She tried to maintain the controlled breathing they'd practiced, but the pain was overwhelming, consuming her entire world. "Something's different," she gasped between waves of agony. "The baby. I think the baby's trying to come now." Thad checked the medical indicators he'd been monitoring throughout the night, and his blood ran cold. According to every measurement he could take, Josie was nowhere near the final stage of labor. But her body was telling a different story, and he realized with growing alarm that this birth was not going to follow the neat, predictable timeline outlined in the medical texts. The baby was coming, ready or not, in the middle of the worst storm in living memory, with only his trembling hands and desperate love to guide them safely through the next few hours. At 2:30 in the morning, with the storm raging like something from the end of the world, Josie's water broke with a rush that soaked the carefully prepared linens and sent Thad's heart racing. This was it: no more false alarms, no more practice runs. The baby was coming whether they were ready or not. "Thad," Josie panted, gripping his hand so tightly he could feel his bones shift. "I need to push. I can't stop it. My body is telling me to push." Fear clawed at Thad's throat, but he forced himself to remain calm. Everything was happening faster than the medical books suggested it should, but Sarah's midwifery notes had mentioned that some labors progressed rapidly, especially when the mother was young and strong. He had to trust that Josie's body knew what it was doing. "Okay," he said, positioning himself according to the careful diagrams he'd memorized. "Listen to your body, but try to push gently. Let the baby come naturally." The next hour was the longest of Thad's life. Between contractions, he monitored Josie's pulse and checked for signs of distress, while she rested as much as possible and sipped water to stay hydrated. During contractions, he coached her through, pushing while silently praying to every deity he could name that nothing would go wrong. Outside, the wind had reached a crescendo that made the house shake on its foundation. Snow was piling against the windows in drifts that would take days to dig through, and the temperature had dropped so low that ice was forming on the inside of the glass despite the roaring fires. They were as isolated from the world as it was possible to be, two people and an unborn child facing the ultimate test of survival. "I can see the head," Thad said suddenly, his voice rough with emotion. "Josie, I can see the baby's head." The miracle of it struck him like lightning. After months of waiting and worrying, after weeks of preparation and fear, here was the actual moment when new life entered the world. The baby's head was dark with wet hair, perfectly formed and unmistakably human, and Thad felt tears stream down his face as he watched this tiny person emerge into existence. "Is the baby okay?" Josie gasped, exhausted from pushing but still fighting with every ounce of strength she possessed. "Beautiful," Thad whispered, supporting the emerging head with hands that were steadier than he'd expected. "The baby looks perfect." Another contraction gripped Josie, and she bore down with the primal determination of a woman bringing life into the world. The baby's shoulders appeared, then the torso, and suddenly Thad was holding a complete human being, slippery and warm and absolutely perfect. "It's a girl," he announced, his voice breaking with joy. "You have a daughter." But his elation turned to terror in the space of a heartbeat. The baby wasn't breathing. Her tiny body was still and silent, her skin a bluish color that sent ice through Thad's veins. He'd read about this possibility in the medical books, but knowing the theory and facing the reality were two entirely different things. "Why isn't she crying?" Josie demanded, trying to lift her head to see. "Thad, why isn't she making any sound?" Thad's mind raced through everything he'd studied about newborn resuscitation. Clear the airway first, then stimulate breathing. His hands moved automatically, following procedures he'd memorized, but prayed he'd never need to use. He cleared mucus from the baby's mouth and nose with the suction bulb they'd sterilized, then began gentle chest compressions while rubbing her back to stimulate respiratory response. "Come on, little one," he whispered, working frantically but carefully. "Come on, breathe for us." The seconds stretched into eternity. Josie was crying now, terrified by the silence where there should have been the healthy wail of a newborn. Thad continued the resuscitation efforts, his own breathing shallow with panic, while the storm raged outside like nature's own fury at the drama unfolding within. And then, like the most beautiful music ever composed, the baby drew her first shuddering breath. It started as a whisper, then grew into a full-throated cry that filled the room with the sound of life triumphant. The baby's skin pinked immediately, her tiny fists waving indignantly at this strange new world she'd been thrust into. Thad laughed through his tears as he wrapped her in the warmed blankets they'd prepared, then placed her gently on Josie's chest. "Hello, sweetheart," Josie sobbed, her hands trembling as she touched her daughter's face for the first time. "Hello, my beautiful girl." The baby's cries quieted at the sound of her mother's voice, and she turned her head instinctively toward the familiar heartbeat she'd listened to for 9 months. In the lamplight, Thad could see that she had Josie's dark hair and what appeared to be her father's determined chin. "She's perfect," he said, settling into the chair beside the bed, where two miracles, mother and daughter, were getting acquainted. "She's absolutely perfect." Outside, the storm was finally beginning to exhaust itself, the wind's howl diminishing to a moan. But inside the warm circle of lamplight, a new family was being born from love and courage and the simple determination to bring light into the darkness. Spring arrived at Hollow Pine Ranch like a promise kept, melting the last of the snow and revealing a world transformed by winter's trials. The storm that had trapped them during baby Grace's birth had become local legend, the kind of weather event people would measure other storms against for decades to come. But for Thad and Josie, it marked not an ending, but a beginning the night their family was truly born. Grace, Elizabeth Carver named for Josie's mother, and baptized in the kitchen sink 3 days after her dramatic arrival, had proven herself to be a child of remarkable determination. At 3 months old, she was thriving under the devoted care of 2 parents who still marveled daily at the miracle of her existence. Thad had taken to calling her "our little storm baby," while Josie preferred sunshine, claiming that Grace's smile could brighten even the gloomiest Montana morning. "She's got your stubbornness," Thad observed one April evening as he rocked Grace in the chair he'd carved with such hope and fear. "Definitely your stubbornness." "And your gentleness," Josie replied from where she sat by the window, sketching in the leather-bound journal she'd started keeping. "Look how carefully she holds onto your finger, like she knows you'll never let her fall." The journal had been Thad's idea record of their unconventional family's daily life, filled with Josie's simple drawings and observations about Grace's development. "Every child should have someone writing down their story," he'd said, presenting her with the blank book on Grace's 1-month birthday. "And this little girl has quite a story already." The legal papers had been finalized the week before Thad's formal adoption of Grace and his marriage to Josie in a simple ceremony performed by Judge Morrison in the courthouse, with Pete and Miguel serving as witnesses. There had been no need for elaborate celebrations. The commitment between them had been forged during those terrifying hours when new life hung in the balance, and the paperwork was merely society's way of recognizing what they'd already known to be true. "I never imagined I could be this happy," Josie said, setting down her pencil to watch Thad sing softly to Grace. "When I knocked on your gate last autumn, I was just looking for shelter and work. I never dreamed I was coming home." "Sarah would have loved you both," Thad replied, the words carrying no sadness now, only gratitude. "She would have been over the moon about this little one." They'd read Sarah's letters aloud to each other several times during the winter, drawing strength from her wisdom and blessing on their unusual love story. The letters now resided in a special box on the mantel, alongside photographs of Emma and Daniel, not forgotten, but integrated into their new family's foundation. The ranch had prospered under their shared care. Josie's natural skill with animals had proven invaluable during calving season, and her organizational abilities had streamlined operations in ways that impressed even Pete's decades of experience. More importantly, the house felt alive, again filled with conversation and laughter, the smell of fresh bread, and the contented sounds of a family growing together. "Speaking of visitors," Thad said, glancing toward the window where dust announced an approaching vehicle, "looks like we have company." The truck that pulled into the yard was unfamiliar, but the young woman who climbed out moved with the careful determination Thad recognized from another pregnant traveler who'd arrived at his gate months earlier. She was clearly with child, though not as far along as Josie had been, and she carried herself with the same mixture of hope and desperation that had first caught his attention. "Might be someone lost," Josie said, but her tone suggested she suspected otherwise. They walked out together to greet their unexpected guest, Grace sleeping peacefully in Josie's arms. The young woman, she couldn't have been more than 20, looked up at them with eyes that held tears barely kept in check. "Are you Mr. Beaumont?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. "I heard in town that that sometimes people can find work here, even if their circumstances are complicated." Thad and Josie exchanged a meaningful look. Life, it seemed, was offering them the chance to pass forward the kindness that had saved them both. "What's your name?" Josie asked gently, stepping forward with the natural warmth that had first drawn Thad to her. "Mary Henderson. My husband died in a mine accident last month, and the company's putting me out of our house next week. I was hoping maybe there might be work. I'm good with animals, and I'm not afraid of hard labor." The echo of Josie's own words from months earlier hung in the air between them. Thad looked at this young woman, then at his wife and daughter, and felt the circle of love and rescue beginning to complete itself. "The bunkhouse needs cleaning," he said finally, "and the stove needs repair. If you're willing to put in the work to make it livable, we'll try it through summer. I can't pay much, but I'll provide meals and shelter." Mary Henderson's face crumpled with relief, and Josie immediately moved to her side, offering comfort with the instinctive grace of someone who remembered exactly how it felt to stand desperate at a stranger's gate. That evening, as they settled Grace in her cradle and prepared for bed, Thad reflected on the strange symmetry of their lives. A year ago, he'd been a man alone, convinced that his capacity for love had died with his first family. Now he was a husband and father again, helping another lost soul find shelter from life's storms. "Do you think we'll keep finding people who need help?" Josie asked, settling into bed beside him for the first time as his wife. "I hope so," Thad replied, pulling her close. "Sarah always said that love multiplies when you share it. Maybe that's our purpose, to be the people who say yes when someone asks if they can work through winter." Outside their window, the lights of the bunkhouse glowed warmly, where Mary Henderson was settling into the same space that had sheltered Josie during her time of greatest need. The cycle was beginning again, but this time, Thad and Josie would be the ones offering hope to the hopeless, proving that sometimes the greatest storms in life are followed by the most beautiful springs.